This is Emily Blackshear with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at the OSU Library. Today is Thursday, July 15th, 2021, and we're in Oklahoma City. This morning I'm interviewing Paul Juhasz for the Deep Roots Oklahoma Authors Oral History Project. Paul, you're a prose poet and author of Fulfillment, Diary of a Warehouse Picker. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So Paul, you've described yourself as living a nomadic life and have lived in many places.
Right.
Let's talk about that, and let's start with where you were born and where you grew up, and then we'll just kind of go from New Jersey on out.
Okay. I was born in a small town in New Jersey, western New Jersey, called Lebanon. My parents moved when I was only a couple years old. We moved up to Connecticut, to a suburb of New Haven called North Haven, an amazingly homogeneous middle-class suburb of New Haven.
Mm-hmm. What was it like growing up there? What do you remember about the landscape or the people or things you like to do for fun?
New Haven's kind of an interesting city. There's an aspect of, lost civilization to New Haven because, it used to be, going back to colonial times, it used to be an amazingly important city,
right.
More important than New York.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's so clearly not.
Yeah.
But there's still vestiges of kind of a sense of importance. Now it's unlike anything else in Connecticut. If you've been to Connecticut and you have a sense of what Connecticut is, it's very mountainous and very, very forested. Not New Haven. New Haven is its own thing. It's a port city, but it's also there's a lot of economic depression. It's at least when I was growing up, it's a very dirty city. Not a lot of joy, and then there's the mob angle, where New Haven's got this kind of hidden, shadowy kind of mob presence. No one knew anyone in the mob, but everyone knew someone who knew someone in the mob. And in fact, the girl I took to her senior prom, we all were convinced that her father was in the mob, and I don't know if he was or if he knew that we thought that and kind of had fun with it. But I remember before we left for prom, he took me on a walk.
Oh no!
And yeah,
sound good.
Right,
you're still here, so
yeah, no, and there's been no horse's head in the bed or anything. But he puts his arm around me and we're walking. He's like, my daughter better come home with a smile on her face. And again, I don't know if he was just playing it up, but it was one of those moments that I was terrified the rest of the night. I didn't have a smile on my face. I don't know if she did. She must have, because as you said,
yeah, you made it.
I made it out.
You made it through. Yeah. So what was it about him you think that made others have that impression?
Well, the population of New Haven, and particularly the suburbs of New Haven, is predominantly Italian American. Mm-hmm. And so everyone either likes to pretend they're the mob or embrace the stereotypes. And it's got a great little Italy in New Haven. And by the way, the best pizza in the world is not in New York. It is in New Haven. It is at Sally's.
At Sally's?
At Sally's, yes. Okay. Everyone, and Pepe's is too, but if you go to Pepe's, it's too touristy and everyone's in line. You'll wait 2 hours.
Yeah. What's Sally's like?
Sally's is, and they're all owned by the same family, which is the irony. And they're all just classic brick oven pizza, very thin crust. I don't know, they do something to the crust that's a family secret, but it is. When Bill Clinton was president, he would stop in New Haven and go to Sally's. Oh. He didn't stop in New York. He stopped in New Haven.
Okay.
And that was always a point of pride for New Haveners, New Havenites. I don't know what the term is. But anyway, back to the reason why we all thought he was in the mob. He looked like the part. I mean, he looked the part, and he dressed the part. He was always wearing pinstripe suits, even though it was August and it's 90 degrees out, and he drove a fancy Lincoln. I mean, he just looked like if Central Casting says, "Hey, we need a mobster," they're gonna call this guy. And so, and he was very generous. If he heard you talking to his daughter, and he wasn't a part of the conversation, but if he just heard you say, you needed money, suddenly he would do the classic pull out the billfold and whip out some cash and say, hey, take care of it, and walk away. So we just all assumed he was somehow a made man.
Yeah. So how long did you live there?
I graduated high school
Okay.
through there, and so that was basically it. So
Okay.
through 18.
You're 18. Do you have siblings?
I have one sister.
Okay, one sister. Are you close?
No, we are not.
No. Okay.
She literally tried to kill me 4 times.
Oh no.
Yes, literally tried to kill me.
Can you talk about that?
Sure.
Okay.
The first time was she gave me something to drink. This is just after I caught her, not caught her. I was invited up
Mhm.
to watch her have a threesome with 2 of my cousins.
Oh,
This is when I was 13, so she
Okay.
was 17 or
She was
16.
older.
Yeah. And the funny part, and I tell the story in the memoir.
Okay.
It's funny because I was watching the Muppet movie first, and they called me up. And then at some point during this, I'm like, I think I'm going to go watch the rest of the movie.
Mhm.
You know, just this, as bizarre as the Muppet movie is,
Mhm.
I prefer it to this. So I'm going to go see what those talking socks downstairs are doing. I'll be down there. But then she came down with a glass and says, "Hey, we want to make sure you're not going to tell. We need you to prove you're, not going to tell. So we want you to chug this." And as a 13-year-old, it made no sense. So it made perfect sense.
Right. Yeah.
So I was about to chug it, and then the older cousin, grabbed it from my hand and said, told Susan, "What are you doing?" It was a glass of Drano.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and I was, I wouldn't have thought
Mhm.
my sister's going to give me a glass of Drano to drink.
Well, yeah.
So I was going to drink it, yeah.
Mhm.
But that was the first time. I know what it feels like to be stabbed,
Mhm.
which is an interesting and odd experience. She held a gun to my head.
Mhm.
That was the last one. The fourth time she held a gun to my head and said, "You need to get out."
Mhm.
So I got out.
Mhm.
That seemed like advisable. And then she bribed 2 boys in the neighborhood, her colleagues, her peers,
Mhm.
to wrap me up in a blanket and take me up and throw me in the pool.
Oh my gosh.
But at the last second, they realized this is probably not. I mean, I was literally taped up and in the blanket,
Yeah.
and they were doing the swinging thing. And one of them said, we shouldn't do this. This is not a good idea. And to be fair to them, they might have realized we're Hungarian and that I might have the Houdini gene. So they might have thought it was just performance art.
Yeah, but it was not.
No, it wasn't.
I'm glad you made it through. So were you writing about any of these experiences at the time? Let's kind of talk about maybe your creative life and where things started from you. A lot of writers, things start for them with these traumatic moments.
Right. Now, my first time where I started writing had nothing to do with any of these stories.
Mhm.
I was writing, I think it was 6th grade. I was just writing stories about adventures of my friends and my close friends and I. And that was quickly halted because I had this little hook. Every story would end, and it's going to sound like it's made up, but it's not. Every story would end with one of my friends whose name was Ken.
Mm-hmm.
He would die. And he would then be back in the next story. And I remember I got sent to the principal for it, and the teacher was all bent out of shape. Ken thought it was hilarious.
Mm-hmm.
He had no problem with it.
Yeah.
And of course, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, then years later in South Park,
I was
steal my idea.
That sounds like Kenny.
Right. They stole
South
my
Park.
idea. I'm like, it's so frustrating. But anyway, and then my father's reaction to that was not pleasant. So I said, okay, and that. It wasn't a conscious decision to stop writing, but it was a moment of like, this is not worth the hassle.
Mm-hmm.
So what I did is I started telling these stories orally.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I started telling the stories about what's going on in my family. I would tell oral stories to my friends, and they would laugh. And then I realized, there might be something here.
Mm-hmm.
And the other place I retreated to was becoming an aficionado of shaggy dog jokes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would constantly tell shaggy dog jokes.
Mm-hmm.
Again, highlighting that orality and storytelling nature of the joke. And so, but I didn't pick up writing these stories again until, God, my late 30s.
Oh.
I was writing other stuff, but I wasn't writing about my family.
About that, yeah. Family can be, that's a tough one. So what was your relationship like with your father and your mom?
My father was a chemical engineer, so he was kind of genetically not able to understand art. And there were bits and pieces where he tried, I think.
Yeah.
But he was. We had a very strained relationship because he was physically abusive, and was not able to ever acknowledge that his daughter had mental issues and was and that's the point of the memoir is not so much my sister trying to kill me, it's my parents not grasping what was going on, and because they couldn't comprehend it. I mean, that's a tough thing to realize. We have a child who's trying to kill people.
Right.
And so their response was just to pretend it wasn't happening. The story about the stabbing, the punchline of that story is, I remember, this is the one, he's finally going to do something about this. There's no way he can ignore a stabbing. So I was like listening at the grate when he went down to yell at her. I was like, this is a moment, it's been 16 years in the making. I can't wait to hear this. And he's like, Susan, don't stab your brother. And that was it. He walked away. That was it? Don't stab your brother. I was like, I think you're a little harsh on her, Dad, don't you think?
Oh my gosh.
So, but that was his way of handling it. There was other moments where, he would find evidence of just how kind of mentally ill she was, and he would just literally push it under the bed or pretend it didn't exist. And so that's always been a very, very big strain on our relationship. And then he's also very, very racist. And that's also been a strain on our relationship. Once I had kids, that was something that I was like, I can't let you be near my kids if you're going to talk like this. Like, he was one of the good people in Charlottesville. Literally one of the good people in Charlottesville. I'm like, I can't let you near my kids if you're going to talk like this.
Yeah. And what about your mom?
My mom was also mentally ill, but not in the I'm going to stab you way.
Yeah. In
the what color is the sky in your world kind of way.
Oh, okay.
Which had a little pleasantness to it. She was a professional astrologer.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and she was just a really kind of quirky, wacky lady who at times was frustrating, but other times was just delightfully fun. Like after my parents got divorced, she wanted us to sleep under pyramids, and bought fiberglass framework pyramids for us to sleep under. She was the only one who saw it through, but it's just, I mean, how delightful is that when you come home and you're from school and your mom's like, hey, we're sleeping under pyramids now.
Yeah, and that's whimsical, and I've never heard of that before.
And I remember,
who does that, right?
It was so weird. She would, after like one of the Star Wars movies, she decided we're going to start saving, we're going to have a robot fund.
Oh, yeah.
And so, and she kept it in an envelope.
Your robot fund?
Yeah, right. I'm like, not like an interest-bearing bond or stocks or anything. We're going to save this in an envelope. And it was hilarious and adorable. And I think we made $172 or something. But, I mean, just stuff like that is nuts. But in a kind of harmless, zany kind of way. So she was fun.
Yeah. But not someone you could talk to about what was happening, or did you feel like you just had to internalize what was going on, like with your sister or with your dad, kind of disconnect yourself from all of that? How did you get through? You mentioned friends, and sounded like maybe you had a close group.
I did. There was one family in particular, the Gankles, that the father was a professor at Yale. And I was good friends with his youngest son, and his oldest son was my sister's age. And my sister, everyone who knew my sister knew, what was going on. So, and I wound up spending so much time there, and just kind of reveling in the normalcy of that family, which is also, Doug Kankel, the father, was just one of the funniest men I've ever met. And so I think that's kind of where I started gravitating to humor. And I remember I would always tell one story to him, and he knew it would set me off, and he would always go, and he's like, tell the snake story. I'm like, I don't want to tell it. He's like, no, I want to tell the snake story. And the story is, my father was landscaping, and he dumped a bag of wood chips. And in the bag was a rat snake, which is not uncommon. It was like maybe a 3-foot long rat snake, and my dad just calmly beheaded it with the hoe and went about the day. But my sister, when she would tell the story, she would swear it was this quoting her, a Canadian constrictor. You know, all those pythons running around in Canada. It was a Canadian constrictor that was like 6 feet long, and my dad was in imminent peril. And it was, of course, and it was venomous too, the only venomous constrictor on the planet. And I would get so frustrated when she would tell the story. I'm like, there's nothing real in your story.
Mm-hmm.
And Doug Hankel would always know I'd get so pissed off telling the story. And he would just laugh and laugh and laugh at the story. And at one point, when I was probably in college, I'm like, why do you keep asking me this? Why do you, this story, don't you understand how frustrating this is for me? It's like, I do, but you've got a funny story out of it. Mm-hmm. And that's when a light bulb kind of clicked. And I'm like, yeah, all right, you're right. Here's a way I can kind of take these events that were on the surface horrible, but so dysfunctionally bizarre because of the characters, my mom and my dad being just impossible people. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is a funny story. Don't Stab Your Brother is a funny story. And so that's where I started kind of like, oh, okay. And that's one of the reasons that when the memoir comes out, it's dedicated to Doug Hankel, because it wouldn't exist if and Hank Jones, because Hank Jones is the one who told me you need to start writing these down.
Yeah, well, let's just go ahead and talk about that, you know, since it is related to family, and then we'll kind of move forward from there and talk about the book that's out now, called Fulfillment. So you worked on this memoir at Red Earth at your MFA?
I was actually working on it before that.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
Tell me about kind of that moment you decided you're gonna write it. You're gonna go back there. I mean, I can't imagine having to relive some of that, because you know, when we write it and we process it and then we're forming it into something that's art, it's intense. It's hard.
It is, but I was writing academic papers primarily. I met Hank when he and I were both professors at Tarleton State down in Stephenville.
Okay, so you were in Connecticut, and then how did you end up in? Because I know you've been in Illinois and some places like that. How did you end up in Texas?
Okay, so when I went to college, I originally went up to Worcester, Massachusetts to play hockey, and this until the point where my dad and I stopped talking. This was still a bone of contention, because he was still of the mind that I should be in the NHL, and I was like, no, I got to exactly the level my talent allowed me to, and I enjoyed it. But so I was playing college hockey, and I was at a liberal arts school, and I didn't feel I was getting a very good education. I mean, it was fun, but I'm like, I'm not really learning anything here. And, you know, I realized that there was no other platform in hockey to go to. So I'm like, if I'm not ever going to play hockey beyond this level, I should probably learn something. And so, much to his chagrin, I transferred to University of Illinois, and that's where I finished my undergrad. And then I went to grad school for English at Illinois State, and that's where I met a particular professor, Dr. Stanley Renner, who was studying Joseph Conrad, and that's who I was studying at the time. And he's like, if you want to go get your PhD, you should go to Texas Tech and study with Leon Higdon, who's at the time was one of the leading Conrad scholars. So that's what I did. Okay. And that's how I got to Texas. And then back to Connecticut, and then back to Texas again. And so that's where I met Hank.
Okay.
At Tarleton.
Yeah, who's also an interviewee for this project, which I'll just go ahead and point that out again if I didn't already mention it. You know, so we were talking before we started recording that this project is documenting a literary community, and the way we all come together, you know, it doesn't always happen in Oklahoma, but there's that tie. So you met Hank,
right? And
he encouraged you.
Right. I was telling him
this work.
I was telling him a story about my grandmother, my mother's mother, who was just an amazingly awful human being, who physically and sexually assaulted me growing up. And so I'm telling him this story about these white stuffed gorillas that my grandfather won in Wildwood, and they gave my sister one, and my grandmother kept the other one. And just how bizarre that became kind of a symbol of this woman to me growing up. And I was telling it with, the way more or less it is in the memoir, and Hank's rolling. I mean, it's a horrible story, but he's laughing. He's like, "You've got to write this down." And so that was the first chapter I wrote down.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started writing more down, and kind of once I had, maybe a dozen chapters, I kind of moved on. I felt I got what I needed to out of the process, and moved on to other stuff. And by that point, Hank was in the Red Earth MFA, and he invited me to visit him for a day.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat in on the workshops, and to be in the presence of Janetta, it's hard to be with Janetta Mish and say, okay, I don't need any more of this. No,
right.
You spend time with Janetta, you're like, I want as much of this as I can possibly get.
Mm-hmm.
And so she stayed on me for a couple of weeks, saying, you should apply. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, you had me at, you should.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. And then she didn't even, I didn't get a say in what I was going to specialize in. Actually, I was thinking I was going to go work with Lou Berney, because I was working on a novel. And I got my classes, and it was clear that Jeanette's like, no, you're writing the memoir, because I sent her a chapter as a writing sample. She's like, you're doing this. And I'm very thankful she did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what year did you start?
2018.
And then tell me who you studied with and just what that experience
Okay, well,
like.
I was with Carrie Cohen for most of it. She was my faculty mentor. And there's no better mentor you can have if you're writing a memoir.
Yeah.
Because she really forces you to really get to the kernel of the pain, and not to shy away with it from it. And also to get the right balance of jokes. Because my tendency is to joke all the time. And she's like, yeah, okay, you're coming off like a psychopath. Right? But you want to joke, so you give your reader permission to kind of have the tension release, and to know that, as far as you can be, you're okay. Mm-hmm. But you also want to show that you understand how serious, the topic is. And if you're just joking all the time, it's like, the reader's gonna be like, I don't know you fully understood the horrible things that happened to you. Mm-hmm. And she made me read a lot of Sedaris, but more importantly, Augustin Burroughs, because Burroughs is great when he's doing that, and when he has a tendency to forget that and just start telling jokes. Mm-hmm. And those are less successful essays of his. And she helped me see that. So that was, most of my time was spent with Carrie. Yeah. I did spend a lot of time with Tim Bradford, also working on the prose poems, which I know we'll talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So before you came to Red Earth and Tarleton in Texas, what were you doing before then? So when you graduated from college, you were going straight to grad school. Did you have any odd jobs or anything like that in between, or were you just teaching? Let's talk about that, because the jobs that you have and what you end up writing about these jobs, I think will be part of our discussion later. But did you do normal stuff?
No, I never did normal stuff. The first jobs I had was my dad was just so bizarrely weird. He insisted I get a job, which is not weird, when I was like 16. And then he did the same thing again when I was in college. I wanted to stay in Illinois for a summer because I didn't feel like going home to the brie field of my family. Yeah. And he's like, that's fine, but you have to get a job. I'm like, that's fine. And so I think I worked in both times at like a Hardee's. I don't even know if they're called Hardee's anymore. I think they're called Carl's. But anyway. And like the first time I went home at 16, I was so excited. I was like, hey, Dad, I got a job at Hardee's. He's like, okay, you can quit now. I'm like, wait, what?
Why?
He's like, no, I just want you to get the process of applying for a job and learning that's what you're supposed to do. You don't actually have to work there.
Oh.
I was like, okay. And the one in college, I had to work for the summer. But this first time at 16, he's like, no, you don't have to work there anymore. And I think it's because he wanted me to work in his factory. So I spent the summer working in his factory. Mm-hmm. And he was, at that point, he was working in metals recovery. Mm-hmm. So you buy all this scrap metal, and then you would have these huge furnaces, and you would melt it all down, and you would create, solder alloys of, some percentage of tin and lead. And so he wanted his son to work with lead with his hands, because what could go wrong? And it was these huge cauldrons. It was like 140 degrees in the corner, and it's summer. It was backbreaking work. I enjoyed the hell out of it, though. I mean, the physicality. It was brutal And I hated it in the moment when you're like, I think I'm melting. I think I'm actually melting right now. But then when you were done for the day, it was a kind of that cool physical exhaustion feeling. So I didn't mind working there. But it was also this weird time to kind of grasp my dad's kind of overt racism. There's this one moment where I met, he employed Jamaican immigrants, and he had one of them stripped down to take his shirt off to show me. And he was like literally like slapping this guy's paddocks. I mean, all was missing was checking the teeth, and it would have been a slave auction.
Oh, goodness.
And he's like, this man's 60. And he was like proud, like, you know, my dad, and it was such, even at 16, I was like, this is a deeply disturbing moment for me. Not only for what you're saying, but the fact that this employee recognizes I can't vocalize anything about how I feel about this.
Right.
And so it was kind of just bizarre. It was just a uniquely bizarre kind of moment. He swears it never happens. You know, my first piece of memoir got published in Bio Stories was about that moment. And he's like, he then sent emails to like everybody else that we knew in common but me, saying that none of that happened. I'm like, wow, people tend not to do that when it didn't happen.
Right. Yeah, which just gets into the subject of memory and how that works in truth. And the thing about writing nonfiction is, you know, the people you're writing about, your characters, can talk back, you know, if they're still living. So did you have more than one exchange like that besides with your dad, with maybe other people in your life you've written about?
Because well, at least with the family stuff, they don't read my work.
Okay.
You know, so I imagine at some point if it becomes, I take that back. My father read Fulfillment when it was in its earlier abridged form. And it was getting serialized in a journal. He read that and was wonderfully supportive, I must say. But I mean, that, and I take that in Fulfillment. Brian, the character Brian, he's read it, and he and I are still we're still friends. And of course, he didn't have anything negative to say because he's one of the few characters that comes off well.
Yeah, he's the one good guy. There's not many.
There's not. And there's one other person I know who worked there, who's read it. He's named James. He's not in the book, and that's what his comment was. He's like, wait a minute, why wasn't I in the book?
Yeah,
because you were normal.
Right.
It's a compliment that you're not in the book.
Yes.
But back to the bad jobs. I got sidetracked. Sorry. So I worked in his factory, and then got into teaching, and I was an English professor for about 14 years, I guess, at junior colleges and then eventually at Tarleton. And then when we moved to Pennsylvania for my wife's job, I couldn't get a full-time job anywhere teaching. It was all adjunct. And when you reach a certain age and you have family, adjuncting is just not a viable option. Yeah. But I tried it for a while, and I was at a community college in Pennsylvania and things were, it was going fine. I got along well with the director, and it seemed like something that might eventually become a full-time job. But this is where the grant from the intro to Fulfillment comes in, where they took a grant from Walmart. And it stipulated, it was a weird kind of thing that Comp 1 kind of changed. And Walmart started having a say, and this is how we want your Comp 1 to be organized. And I guess from their point of view, they were trying to, I guess they wanted, some level of writing proficiency in employees or something like that.
Oh,
interesting. I try to go back and figure out what their angle was, and I can't quite work it out. But, because at that point in my life, I was more of an idiot than I am now. And, I like to take stands that are really not worth taking. Teaching, I would always take inspiration as a teacher from, Dead Poet Society and Mr. Holland's Opus. And then at some point I realized those movies end with the teachers unemployed. You should probably watch different teaching movies. But so I decided I'd make a stand there and said, I can't live under these conditions where I can't control assignments and what I do in my class. And not only do I not have a say, but you're giving that sale to Walmart. I'm out.
Yeah, and that's just kind of bizarre,
It
really.
was very bizarre. And, I should have stuck it out. It was a temporary thing. It was a one semester thing. That was one of those stands you look back on and say, yeah, I just should have ignored it, and done my thing. Say, yes, I'll do that, and just do my normal coursework and then let it pass. But, I didn't think it through. And you see the trouble it got me into. So then I worked for Amazon. I went and took a night shift job working as a picker.
Yeah, so
in Amazon.
Let's talk about that and the book, which, that's our main. So you talked a little bit about how the story came about and how you ended up writing about your time there. So let's contextualize this just a little bit. So you're in Pennsylvania. What year was this? When?
Oh,
2013-ish?
that sounds about right, yeah.
I feel like that sounds right.
Right.
How did you find this job? How and why? How and why?
Well, so we were living in an apartment at the time because it was during the housing crunch, and we weren't able to sell. We had 10 acres in Texas, a nice new house. We were actually neighbors to Jewel.
Really?
Yeah, but I mean, I can't think of the name of the rodeo guy. Ty Murray?
Oh, yeah.
Is that who she's married or was married to? Yeah, so Ty Murray and Jewel are the place next to us. We literally never saw them because their place is like, 7,000 acres, and then we're this little sliver. But it's still fun to brag. And so, but we couldn't sell it. So we're paying mortgage on that, and we're living in an apartment, and we were struggling to make ends meet, and we weren't making ends meet on the adjunct salary.
Right.
And so in the mailroom of the apartment complex Amazon was doing a full court press, and they pay well. I mean, that's one thing that can't be denied about Amazon. They pay well. They paid much better than I would have been making as an adjunct. So I kept kind of dipping my toe in. Maybe I should. No, I'm not doing that. Maybe I should. And then finally, you get to a point when you start to see the impact of not being able to pay a bill, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna go do this.
And you had kids?
We had 2 young kids.
At the time,
yeah, they were. I think PJ was just starting school, or not even in school. He was still in daycare. So and so they were.
That's
very
a lot
young.
of stress. Just
right.
The day to day. How are we gonna be fed and clothed and keep our apartment and all of that?
But there was a part of that too, though, that I kind of didn't want to give up because my wife was working. I was the one who was with them watching Sesame Street and all these mind-numbingly painful shows. And so there was a point at which I was like, I'm going to kind of miss that. Yeah. And that's why I think that's what led to the decision to work on the night shift. And of course, literally as soon as I took the job, like maybe 2 months, not even 2 months in, 2 weeks in, excuse me, we sold our house and we bought another house. And so the whole impetus was like, I just needed to hold out for 2 more weeks. Okay. All right. But then I kind of liked the job when I started. It was novel and interesting.
And intense. It kind of goes back your story about working in your dad's factory, physically exhausting. So what was it like in the warehouse? And you describe it in the book. And your first, I think I wrote down the first sentence of your first day one. I fear, entered an odd, incongruent world. And you talk about the Sarge. And I wanted to talk about your last name. It's Hungarian. Could you spell it?
Sure, it's Juhaszz.
And your supervisor, it kind of blew his mind a little bit.
Right. He decided it was Hispanic, which I've actually run into a lot, odd enough. But never in a way that was this brazen and repeated. And you try to, usually when it happens with normal people, you would correct them and they would make a note of it and you'd go about your day. But for whatever reason, this guy, the Sarge, who wasn't a sergeant, just kind of thought it was a cool title, so he adopted it. He just couldn't process what I was telling him. So I was Hispanic in his mind for the rest of our interactions. Just a weird world. Yeah. But and the to describe the place, which if you haven't been, and Amazon's pretty, I guess, rigid about letting people inside and see what it is. So the building itself is probably the size of a city block. I mean, it's just a massive, massive building. And the middle would be administration, like the administration that would interact with workers. The actual higher ups would be in offices that you never got to see. And to the left and right part of this building would be what were called the mods. And this is where all the product is stored. And each mod is about maybe 6 football fields long and maybe 3 deep. And there's 3 levels. And and each level is, seemingly endless rows of endless bins. I mean, it's hard to ever kind of give a sense of just how much product is in one of these buildings. And then you realize Amazon's got, 3 dozen across or more across the country. And so you work in one mod for the day. But sometimes they just would forget that. And so you'd have to walk in from the east mod over to the west mod. They called the area you were allowed to walk, so you didn't get hit by forklifts or anything. The Green Mile, which is just which is so wonderfully kind of not clued in.
Yeah, that's uplifting, isn't it?
It kind of fit, and they called it because it was marked off with green tape, and so you can see.
Oh no, someone did that on purpose, right?
I have to hope so.
Is this a joke? Do you think that's how someone had fun?
I hope so.
A little bit.
I hope so, because otherwise it's so not clued in and tone deaf that I hope there's somebody who has a sense of humor said or maybe somebody being subversive like I try to be. Said,
right, because you had your moments with your supervisor.
They were quite fun. Yes.
Did he catch on who he knew who it was?
No.
Or he didn't really.
No.
He couldn't figure it out.
If he did, he never confronted me. He never caught out onto. I mean, he obviously, when I was messing with him to his face, like saying, "Hey, this is broken," and then shaking the Lego box. I mean, those kind of things. I mean, obviously he knows it's me because I'm there. But the more subtle kind of subversive things I would do, or writing on the chat board.
Yeah.
The VOA board.
Tell me about that. Because you talk about it in the book, but let's just explain that, and then I wanted to also talk about the TOT, the time off task, and just give me a sense of your pace, because it sounds like it was just nonstop movement.
Yeah.
It's hard to even reading your book and talking to you about it now. It's just kind of hard to really visualize all of that, but. I know probably anyone listening to this right now has used Amazon for something at least once. So it's kind of good to know what the people behind the scenes are, what they're doing. Yeah, so let's talk about the board first and then the TOT. There's all these abbreviations and things too. It's like its own jargon and thing.
Well,
part of the world.
The board was, I think it was VOA, right? Voice of the Associate Memory Service. And this was midway more or less through the process. So this wasn't a system that was in place when I started.
Yeah.
But they thought it was a good idea to kind of give the workers a voice. So they literally had a dry erase board. And you could write whatever question or problem you had that you wanted solved. And so I would start. I think the first one I put there was Fire Mike, who was the boss. I liked. He wasn't even my boss, right? Because that was even the funnier thing is he wasn't my boss. Our actual boss was a very timid man who hid from us all the time, and he was what's called a process assistant. So he's I guess just oversight, but he couldn't actually. Once I learned he couldn't actually fire me unless I fell below rate or stole something. I was like, oh, game on. I'm gonna have some fun because he was a real, as the book, and as he was a real mean-spirited kind of person, and liked to kind of break people, particularly the older women who would work there. He would take great delight in making them cry and eventually getting them fired. And there was a guy who couldn't walk anymore because every picker gets plantar fasciitis at some point, and he had a doctor's note restricting him to light duty. So Mike thought, your light duty is you're gonna sweep the warehouse until you can't do that, and then we're going to fire you. So it wasn't just I want to kind of spitting out of my boss. It was kind of a mash-in. Let me point out the absurdity of this, and then you're my target. So anyway, I just started writing stuff on the VOA board about Mike, and then I started writing on the VOA board as if I was Mike, because I was able to get from his badge his ID number, and so I would put that there, and they would respond, because that was the setup. It's like we will always respond to what you write, and they did, but they didn't know how to respond. We didn't foresee this coming. We thought everyone would be docile kind of workers.
Didn't have a writer among them.
And a pissed off writer at that.
Right.
So, but in time off task was anything. The idea of a picker's life is you're constantly moving. You have a scanner, and the computer generates your pick path for the shift. And it's expected you're supposed to pick on average 1,200 items a night. And the computer will tell you this is the next item you got to go pick, and this is the mod and the floor and the bin and the aisle. And then it will literally have a timer that the computer decides it's going to take you 53 seconds to get to that pick, and it will count it down.
Wow.
And then if you don't get there, if you don't scan the product in 53 seconds, it starts counting it down in red, and whoever whoever is at the station is getting an alert that this guy's time off task. So things we would take for granted in a working environment, like talking to a coworker, saying, "Hey, how was your weekend?" Can't do that. Don't have time. Going to the bathroom. Can't do that. You don't have time. Tying your shoelaces. Well, if you're ahead of rate, you probably can, spend a couple seconds tying your shoelaces. If not, you don't have time. You literally could not stop walking, or you'd be time off task. Unless you had a pick path, or there's a level at which you can get ahead of your pick path. But it's by forgetting you're a human being. And you'd see that too. You'd see people, then they'll post every quarter shift, they'll post your rate. And you want 100% rate, obviously, but you would see people run to the boards and celebrate that they're like, I'm at 150%, and you're just
you mentioned that in the book. It's not 100% wasn't enough.
No, they wanted you to do more.
But without any kind of bonus, right? Or you're not going to get promoted. And you kind of talked about how the firing system, how you had 45 days, is that right?
Timeout.
It's like a timeout. So you get fired, but it's never really over for anyone. You just can't move up. No one can get to that 2-year mark.
Right.
And it's all part of the business plan. Is that, look at that.
Sure.
The built-in firing and the temporary nature of it.
I think, because they would, if you got fired, you could, in 45 days, you could reapply. Unless you stole something. And there's a character in there who works for, during the the peak season, during Christmas. And he got originally fired for having sex with a coworker in an aisle. When you can say, okay, yeah, firing makes sense.
Right, yeah.
Good on you, Jeff. And then, but they hired him back, because his 45 days had expired, and it was so weird. And then the other thing you mentioned we're talking about is this. Well, first of all, you're never an employee of Amazon when you start. You're an employee of a temporary agency whose only client is Amazon.
Oh, okay.
And that's done so they can get out of paying you benefits. And
contract, is it like a contract worker?
Yeah. Kind of. So that's insidious.
Yes.
And then once you show that you have a certain proficiency, they'll convert you to an Amazon worker. And if you're there for 2 years, you get 5 shares of Amazon stock. But what happens often with pickers is right when you're near 2 years, the computer-generated pick path suddenly has you going from the east mod to the west mod in the middle of a shift.
Yeah. Which is just such a distance, right?
Right.
That you were describing earlier.
And just impossible pick paths. And then you're falling below 100%, and then magically you get fired. They don't do that to everybody, obviously. It'd be too obvious. But you see and there's one guy I met in there he was another guy who comes off well, is Wendell. I met him early, and he was an older guy, and he was so wise and so interested in helping people, which was odd, because most people don't. Yeah. They don't want to acknowledge anybody else there.
Right.
Because I think, because then they have to acknowledge the system they're in too, right? So it's easier just to kind of put blinders on and do your thing. But he always took time out to help new people.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a moment where he was getting really stressed because he knew his 2 years were coming up. And then he was just, one day he was just gone.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't realize they're gone until, well after they're gone, because you don't see the same people every day.
Oh.
Because pick paths, right? You might
get a new path. So there's just no way to really have friends.
Right.
Or that camaraderie. There's no time for that water cooler talk.
Right.
The dehumanization of the workers and just what you experience, I think, is definitely a theme throughout the book. Mm-hmm. And you look at that through the lens of humor as well, which makes sense, given how you've used humor throughout your life. Was there a particular moment in the story or in this book that you thought was really representative of this, of feeling dehumanized? Because there's just so many examples. Basically the whole book is an example of that. But if you had to pick one to really describe the no sense of human connection.
I guess the moment, there are two come to mind. One's real short. There's a moment in one of the peak season section of the book where a new worker comes up to me and says, "Hey, he clearly had a question about the scanner." Mm-hmm. And he's like, "You look like a nice guy." And I kind of like tell him to go fuck off, basically. Mm-hmm. And I champion this as saying, I told him the value of not judging a book by its cover. But that was a moment where, in the moment I didn't reflect on it. But as I'm walking later, I'm like, what an ass I just was. This was a human being asking for help. And I, and as someone who was on guard against the process of dehumanization, I should have known better than anybody. Mm-hmm. Not to give into that. And here's a moment where I did.
Yeah.
And like you said earlier, I can't go find the guy and apologize because, we have pick paths. I never saw him again. I mean, mm-hmm. I don't think anything insidious happened. I assume he just finished his peak season part-time shift and moved on. But
yeah.
We had never bumped into each other again. And so I never had a chance to apologize. I think that was one of the moments. And one moment still bothers me today. I really feel bad about that moment.
Yeah.
And the other one that comes to mind is it's late in the book, and I have to give Hank Jones credit for this, because I always thought, for me, the kind of the core, the kernel of the book, where I think I try to put things in some perspective. For me, was I was talking to a coworker named Kevin, and Kevin and I started at the very beginning. And we had watched our cohorts get from the training, initial training, kind of get picked off one by one. And Kevin was gay, and I asked him, I'm like, why do so many gay workers work here? I mean, it was the population was probably, I don't know how to guess, but it seemed like it was very, very high, much higher than just kind of a cross section of non-Amazon world. And he's like, because we feel comfortable here. Everyone is so exploited and dehumanized. We don't stand out. We're all dehumanized at the same level. So there's a weird, fucked up kind of sense of equality here at what price? And I always thought that was the kernel of the book. And I still kind of think it is. But Hank's pointed out for him, and I think he's right, is where I try to explain Matt to Carla.
Yeah. We need to talk about your characters. So there's a few, but there's Matt and Brad.
Matt and Brad, yeah.
Let's start with Matt.
Matt.
This guy. He's real.
Yeah.
And we were talking before we started the recording that he's just so bizarre. You can't make him up. So let's talk about him.
Matt looks like a Simpsons character, just in the way he was shaped and formed and kind of moved through space. But and he was I don't even know what the right word is. He was very frustrating because he was annoying and never picked up on the fact he was annoying.
Yeah.
And kind of just assumed everyone wanted to know everything going on in his life. And so eventually people would not talk to Matt or go out of their way to as much as you could to avoid Matt. And for some reason, he just seized on me early on as someone who would talk. I was like the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. I was like the wedding guest for this guy. And I just never had the cruelty. I never had the moment with the peak season worker to be cruel to him. Although I would push back when he was being
you'd
annoying.
correct him or just say you're wrong. That's not how it works. But he didn't.
He's oblivious to it.
But he didn't get it. He just
No.
and you. Yeah, I forget where it was in the book where you explained one of those conversations. He just circled back to wherever he started.
Mm-hmm.
It made no sense. You told him how, I think it had to do with sports. You told him how it was. And he's like, okay, I'm just going to go back to this original point that was wrong.
I think that what you're talking about is he was a fan of the Baltimore Ravens.
Yeah.
Because they had just won the Super Bowl. The previous year, or one of the previous years, anyway, and so that day they had just been eliminated from the playoff contention. Right, there's no way they can make the playoffs. They were like 2 games behind the first place team with 1 game to go, and he was saying basically it's not over. I still have hope, and I'm like, it has nothing to do with hope. It's math.
Yeah,
and he does this. I have faith, and he walks away, and you're like, oh my God, Matt. These are numbers. And in every conversation.
Yeah, that kind of sums him up, I think. Because every conversation was kind of like that. Just, he didn't get you or people, but he lasted, though. I guess he
was
had a good production rate, or wasn't the TOT. But you saw him out in public once.
Right. I was at a Buffalo Wild Wings with my son, and he walked in and he sat at a table right behind us, and I told my son, I said, don't look now, but that's Matt. And he looked over eventually and he's like, that's exactly what I expected Matt to look like. Mm-hmm. But Matt had no comprehension that I was me. You know, we had worked together for all that time, and all
those hours.
And I saw him every day, it seemed like. I mean, I'm sure I didn't, but it seemed like, I'm not seeing all my friends and the people I like talking. I'm not seeing Brian every day. But Matt somehow is always there. And no recognition at all. That, oh, that's the guy I would just go up to and say, yeah, so it's my cousin's birthday. As if we were having this conversation earlier and got interrupted. And I'm like, you know, that's the one where he's talking about he's a 4th generation American. And I'm like, that's not how any of this works, Matt. No. But no recognition that I existed, which is perfect, Matt.
Mm-hmm. And it really fits into this environment, too, this alternative world that you were living in at night. How long were your shifts?
They were, in non-peak season, it was 10 hours.
10 hours. Okay.
And peak season became 12. And it was 5 days a week. Mm-hmm. You walk on average 18 to 20 miles a night. Wow. Nonstop. Mm-hmm. So one of the jokes I think is somewhere is like, I now know what it's like to walk to Maryland. Mm-hmm. And I know I can do it in a couple of months.
Yeah.
Goodness, Brad, that was the other guy. Brad.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Brad, he was also on my list because you read about Brad at the saw you read at the Tidewater Winery series, and this guy, I'll just let you explain him. That's all I can say. That's my review of Brad.
Good luck, Paul. Explain Brad. Brad was again another person who should not exist, but did. And he was about maybe 10 years, maybe in his early 60s or late 50s by the time I met him. And his shtick was he was just a classic perverted old man kind of guy, and would just brazenly sexually harass the female workers. Yeah. And you'd wonder why he didn't get caught, and then you realize, well, that guy, the Sarge, is in charge of HR. And you're like, oh yeah, that's why. Yeah. But so he would, his thing was he would try the sex toys out, and he came for some reason again the wedding guest and Ancient Mariner. He felt, oh, that's a guy who needs to hear the story. So he came to me and admitted one day that he would take some of the sex toys into the bathroom and try them out, so he would know if they're worth buying. And I don't know what you say to that when someone tells you that. Yeah. But every indication with Brad was kind of like that. And Amazon being Amazon, they sell a lot of sex toys. They sell a lot of porn. And
yodeling pickles.
Yodeling.
That's a bad moment to bring that up. I just have it written down in my notes. That's from day 65, by the way, but not from Brad. But yeah, lots of very random stuff, but just miles and miles and miles of this product that we consume. And Brad is testing it out.
Yes. Volunteering, right?
And staying employed.
And it feels comfortable enough or
about it.
That he can talk about it, right? That he's not, and no sense of shame in what he's doing, that this is, this is my contribution to making Amazon successful. That's why Amazon has the smiley face on the box.
Now we know. Got that. So, we were talking a little bit before we started recording just about how exhausting this job was and how you were keeping track of it mentally. So let's talk about how you actually got around to writing anything down.
Okay. So and I guess, I don't know what the initial genesis was, but what would happen is I would have one of these interactions. I would have an interaction with Brad admitting he tests the sex toys. And I would rehearse the joke the rest of the shift. I would just kind of write a form of this story, of this interaction in my head the rest of the shift. And just literally over and over again until it was memorized. And that's what I would do to fill the time. Because you couldn't do anything. You couldn't listen to music. My very favorite post in there is where I explained to Mike, this wouldn't suck if we could listen to music on an iPad. And he'd be like, well, we can't because we sell iPads. And we don't know if you stole them. And then I point out, well, you also sell pants. So I guess I should stop wearing pants. And he didn't find it very funny. But so to keep myself occupied, I would just go over and over that particular entry. And then when I would get home and, soak my feet in hot water. And before I collapsed with exhaustion, I would get on the computer and I would post that on Facebook as a diary of a Amazon picker. And so that's where the book came from, is these months of Facebook posts that eventually created their own following. And I would have, well, two things happened. One, I had a friend from grad school say, hey, my wife is going to send you a friend request. And here's her name, just so you know who this is, because I want her to be able to read these posts. And then shortly after that, a few days later, the woman who married Chris Cankel, my friend from growing up, she's like, I just want to let you know that at the Cankel Christmas gathering, we just got together and we just read your Facebook posts and just laughed.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's when I'm like, maybe there's a book here. And so that's when I started putting the book together and trying to figure all these random kind of moments, what's the best way to form them into some kind of coherent story.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about that, just the process of putting it together and finding a publisher.
Okay. No one wanted to touch it.
Yeah.
I had agents who said, yeah, it's really funny, but I'm not touching it. And I had publishers who, had basically said the same thing. I had one house, I can't remember which one it was. It was a small press, and they rejected it. But then one of the editors wrote a separate thing saying, "But I want you to know we're quoting your entries around the office. I don't think he likes me very much." And all these little tags they were going around quoting it. And but the reason is they didn't want to risk angering Amazon in any way, shape, or form. And then I had forgotten about it. I had moved on to writing the memoir and doing other stuff. And discovered prose poetry. So I had forgotten about it and said, this is just something that's never going to exist. And then Roxy Kirk over at Fine Dog Press, I guess I read it once at Scissortail. The first time I was at Scissortail, I read from that. And she and I got to talking. She's like, yeah, I couldn't care less if Amazon's angry by this. Let's do it. And she found a great cover, and now it's out there.
Yeah. Yeah, and she's also someone that I've interviewed too. So, again, it's back to this community and the people who support us. I know Hank has been real important to you and encouraging you to get your work out there and write through hard things. Let's talk about prose poetry.
Okay.
Before we started recording, we were talking about that. a bit, and poets have differing opinions on what it is and is it poetry. So what's your understanding of it, of the genre?
Okay. Well, it's a wonderful kind of subgenre because there's a couple of things that really speak to me about it. One is it's traditionally been a subversive kind of genre, intentionally kind of subverting the idea of poetry. It's not like someone sat down to write a poem and then they wrote something that was in a paragraph and they're like, oh my God, how did that happen? They're intentionally subverting the form. And I've always been drawn to, the person sticking the finger in the eye for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
So that's appealed to me, and it's also been a form that privileges kind of the surreal and humor. You can tell if you're going to tell a joke in a poem, it's so much easier in a prose poem. It's not that you can't in a lineated poem.
Yeah.
It's just a lot harder because you have less words and you have all these other things that are controlling what your poem looks like.
Right.
When you give that up and you say, I'm going to exchange the line for the sentence and the stanza for the paragraph, you've got more freedom to be funny or bizarre. I mean, prose poems are amazingly bizarre.
Yeah.
Particularly my favorite prose poetess is Russell Edson, who creates this really bizarre kind of world. It's hilarious, but also really kind of profound and poignant. And just the idea that there's no kind of agreed upon form. There are prose poems that are like bulleted lists.
Yeah.
There's a great prose poem called Cold Calls by Tyrone Williams that the whole poem is in the footnote and endnotes. The actual poem, quote where it be, is just white space. And he's using that to make points about racial tension in America, and it's brilliant. But I also you look at that and say, well, how's that a poem? And it comes down because even in the footnotes, he's making use of all the poetic devices, figurative language, and there's turns and all the things you would associate, craft elements you'd associate with the poem. It just looks different.
Yeah.
So, and those are the things that I think kind of draw me to it. And there's just lots of fun to write too. Yeah. And the other thing I would say, actually, now I just thought about it, is my early prose poems, they're not necessarily good, but I'm going back in the form. I'm going back to deal with the toxic masculinity in mine and my family, and dealing with my father and his own. They're all just kind of awful people. And the poem I wrote was about beards. And I can't grow a beard, as you can see. It's just ridiculous. But they all got these really full kind of post-apocalyptic kind of character actor beards, and they always made fun of me for not. And so the poem is dealing with that. So I'm using figurative language. I'm using the beard as symbol. But for years, I tried to write that in other traditional genres. I tried to write short stories or memoir. It just comes out like I'm bitching. I tried to write just a regular poem, and I couldn't do it. And then when you're not worried about what the poem looks like, and you're just writing, you're like, now I've got something that works here. That in a way that I couldn't get before I knew about the prose poem.
Great. Did you bring anything to read, or was there anything that you wanted to read during the interview?
Well,
I brought your book, but you had mentioned before that I wasn't sure if you had something else.
I did bring a few prose poems. Just in case.
I'd like people to just listen to this to kind of get an idea of what these are and what you can do. And
all right. Well, I'll start with this one. It's called "She Received a Mysterious Plant," and I think one of the reasons I brought this one because it really kind of highlights just the surreal kind of nature of prose poems, and just kind of there's also an interesting little discussion of process here. This poem came about because a friend and I challenged each other to write prose poems. We gave each other the first line. Okay, I said, go write a prose poem. So she received a mysterious plant, and I had to try to write something about it. So here's what I came up with. She received a mysterious plant. Everything about it was mysterious. The pot granular, sugary like Kool-Aid. A faded Tucson decored with pale blue Kabbalistic images. Hieroglyphics reading anaphractious, although she never knew this, not speaking plant. When she watered the plant, a full cup every week as the dream directed her, the pot liquefied, flowed away, exposing the rounded trapezoid of soil. And about that soil, flaked feldspar, interspersed with what looked like the novelty gum nuggets sold in small burlap sacks in vintage candy shops. Could very well be the novelty gum nuggets sold in small burlap sacks in vintage candy shops, for she never had the nerve to taste it. The plant itself a tattered assemblage of leftover parts, some leaves, some succulent spines, a little evergreen. She thought spruce, maybe juniper, but she did not know about such things. There were flowers, berries, cones, other arboreal accessories as yet unidentifiable. It was a mess, really. A collage of cast-off pieces. And did I mention the shimmering? The plant shimmered. Sometimes it looked to her like it was dancing. Other times it vanished completely, did an invisible lap around the room, and reappeared almost, but not quite, in the exact spot from which it left. Such a mysterious plant. Everything about it was mysterious, even who sent it to her. But sometimes, if she squinted just a bit and caught the plant in just the right light, it looked like everything she'd always wanted.
And then just visually, you put that all in just paragraph.
Yeah, it's all one
Yeah.
long paragraph,
Yeah.
except for the last line is
Right.
is on
Yeah.
top.
I mean, and you can hear it. I think maybe this will come across on the recording. Why it works in this form is I think if you did add the line and paid attention to that, it would it breaks up the flow, because it's its own little world in a way that you're creating these flashes of the human experience
Right.
maybe that we're doing. Yeah, so that was great. Was there anything else that
I don't mind. I read one more just because it shows.
Yeah.
Because this is a prose poem that's just a list of dad jokes.
Okay. Great.
But I think it works in some level. Maybe I'm wrong, but anyway, it's called Wisdom, and then Wisdom Continued. So wisdom is, my son asks me, what rhymes with orange? No, it doesn't, I answer. What month has 28 days, he asks. All of them, I reply. If he of geese fly overhead, do you know what they call Canadian geese in Canada, I ask? No, geese. Tonight he shall dream of dust while I stay awake, wondering if the bathroom faucet is crying or merely uninspired. And then the companion piece is the next day, Wisdom Continued. What's brown and sticky? I asked my son the following morning. Don't know, don't care, he replied. No, really, what's brown and sticky? I don't know. What? A stick. He groans. Hey, I say as we have breakfast, do you hear they're not making bananas any longer? What? Really? Yep. They've decided bananas are long enough. Stop, Dad. Please, stop. I choose to ignore what sounds like anger in his voice. 2 clowns are eating a cannibal, I say, and his face brightens. He gives me the smirk of the victor. One turns to the other and says, does this taste funny? He crows in delight at the stolen punchline. You're not listening, I say. 2 clowns are eating a cannibal. One turns to the other and says, I think we have this joke wrong. His eyes crush down, his defeat manifest. But then he smiles, nodding in complete, perfect understanding. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's not a poem, right? It's a collection of jokes, but it is a poem.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what the beauty of the prose poem can be.
There's the elevated language, but then we're going back to kind of the ordinary and the everyday too, which is a subject for poetry. But to make it into something that's more than just a casual joke or whatever takes some skill and thought, for sure. And I think just shows the just the flexibility of the genre, because those are very different.
Right.
And then it's different in your book.
I'm glad you said that word. I mean, that's the key word, right? Flexibility. That's what I love about prose poems, is they're so flexible in so many different ways. Which I guess that's what flexibility means.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of set You set the rules, though.
Right, right. Yeah, there are no
which
rules.
just really goes right. Which just really, given what we've talked about in the interview about your experiences and how you've dealt with things throughout your life and how you're also dealing with that on the page and what you create. I mean, it all just kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
I hope.
Yeah. So what do you think you learned about yourself as a poet or just as a writer over the years, maybe especially the last 3 or 4 or something like that?
That's an interesting question. I think I've learned that experience is valid. And because one of the first things I remember when I went to my dad and said I was going to write a memoir, his first answer was, why? Who the hell would want to hear your story? And at the time I thought, well, yeah, that's a pretty good point. Who the hell wants to hear about me? But then you get a sense of, well, you need to give witness to what happened to you, but also there are other people who are being, sexually abused and physically abused by their parents and their family, and they need to hear that. They need to know they're not strange. I remember a story. My high school English teacher, her name was Claire Georgie. She was also Hungarian. Wonderful lady. She used to teach at Yale and then was teaching high school just because she didn't feel like giving up teaching anymore. And she knew my last name in Hungarian meant shepherd, so she called me Little Shepherd, which is not a nickname you want in high school. I was like,
no.
Can you please stop? But I remember she told a story about when she was 16, she was in Budapest during the failed revolution, and so she literally saw her uncle get put up against the wall and shot, and so she's fleeing literally by herself and with only what she can, clothes on her back and whatever she can gather. And one of the things she gathered was Hamlet. And she didn't really kind of think it through. She just, this is a book I enjoy, and I, it's here. I see it, so I'm going to grab it. And as she's trying to flee Hungary to get to Austria, she gets stopped twice and raped by Russian soldiers. And she's pondering suicide, in the days that follow this. And the one thing that kept her alive was reading Hamlet's "To Be or Not to Be" speech. And being aware of the fact that I'm not a freak. The things I'm feeling right now, they were feeling, 400 years ago. And they figured out a way to get past it. So my experience is not unique, and there's a way through it. And I think that's what I learned about writing the memoir is, not that I'm saying I'm Shakespeare by any stretch, but there's a chance that someone's going to read that at some point and say, oh, I'm not a freak. This happens. This is just stuff that happens.
Yeah.
And there are ways of dealing with it. And, chances are excellent. If you try, you can get past it. That's one of the things I learned. And I guess the other thing I've learned just as a writer is to trust the idea. I mean, that's really, I don't have much of a writing process, but I've learned what it is. I've learned to trust the idea, and the idea will tell you when it's ready, and it will tell you what form it is, what it needs to be. I mean, I had a great idea a long time ago about a story I wanted to write about a guy with daddy issues. That was the name of the story, actually, daddy issues. So he joins a support group, and in the support group is like, Hamlet is in the support group, and Luke Skywalker's in the support group, and Jesus is in the support group. Frankenstein's mom, and Harry Chapin has a little bit role, and I was like, so this is gonna be a hilarious story. But I wrote it maybe 5 or 6 times, and it was crap every time, and I couldn't figure it out. But then the idea is like, that's because I'm a prose poem dummy. I'm like, oh, okay. And I think I even tried it before that. I tried it as a play, and it just none of it was working. And so that's what I learned. If you learn to give your idea space. I know we're supposed to sit at the computer and write something every day, and there's value in that.
Yeah, some do and some don't, but
if you want to work, I want to work on this, and you sit down and you're just staring at the screen. That's the idea, saying work on something else today. Go work on that poem or go work on that sort. Don't leave me alone. I'll let you know when I'm ready. And that's one of the reasons I take these wacky jobs, like,
Yeah.
driving for Uber or I worked on a garbage truck for a long time. It's because they give you that mental space to let the idea brew. And, it'll let you know.
Yeah. So once it does come to you, what's your writing process like then?
Yeah, then it's like I've got to drop everything and make sure I'll run over children if I have to get to the computer just so I can write it down.
Yeah.
Because there was a time where I would remember, like the Amazon entries, I would just rehearse it and I'd be confident. If it takes 2 days, I'm long past those days. I need to write it down.
Yeah.
So, I either, if I'm home, obviously I just drop everything and say, okay, today I'm writing. Or if I'm on the road, I carry one of those old, I don't have it with me, which I just lied. I say I carry, I don't. Usually I carry those old black and white composition books.
Okay, I was going to ask how you do it because people really handle it differently. Some like to keep some like notes on their phone, or some people like having a notebook. So you like having a notebook?
I do. I carry that with me. That's why I keep it in the front seat so Uber riders don't try to sit in the front seat because that's really awkward. Yeah. When they try to do that, I'm like, I don't know, you sit in the back. But now I put the journal there, so there's stuff there, and usually they take the hint, they go in the back seat. But I try to do the phone because Hank does the phone. Hank will write poems on the phone. Yeah. And I try to do it, and I don't know.
I mean, he likes the feel of it, and didn't like the sensation of writing. I mean, it's a different sort of experience.
Yeah, and I'm a horrible texter, so I write other words and
for the autocorrect.
I wrote a prose. Yeah, I wrote a prose poem because I was trying to write. I share it, and the prose poem made it a name. And then share it. I'm like, who the hell is this share it guy? Yeah, but it became a prose poem. But I can't text like Hank does. I'm like, I don't know. Yeah. Fat thumbs or Hungarians aren't good at it. I don't know what the problem is.
So how do you know when something's ready, like, that you're done?
When I'm not embarrassed for someone else to read it.
Oh, okay.
I guess. And if you go, I've got a folder of the printed poems, and you can see based on which side they're on. They're like, okay, I feel comfortable enough showing this to somebody. But there are times where and again, it goes back to trusting the idea, I guess. Yeah. Where okay, I've got a draft of this, and but the idea is I'm not done yet. This is just a skeleton. I need some flesh. I need some clothes. Yeah. Don't show me anybody yet.
Yeah. It takes some patience.
It does.
But it really does. And again, back to community. So do you have many trusted readers that you kind of give your stuff to? I mean, being in one thing I've definitely noticed about Red Earth MFA students and alum is how supportive they are of each other. Do you have that kind of network with people, like 2 or 3 readers that you like to share stuff with, or?
To some extent, Hank is obviously one of them, and there's a few other people that are in Red Earth, but mostly one of the cool things about moving to Oklahoma is there's such a vibrant writing community here that didn't exist in Pennsylvania. I would tell people I'm a writer in Pennsylvania, and their first answer almost always was, how are you going to make money doing that? Which surprised me because it's supposed to be a progressive state. But here, even people who aren't writers just instinctively kind of understand the value of art here. But the writing community here is so, so there are so many open mics, and they're almost always populated by people that I've grown to really, really trust. And so, a lot of times that open mic where I'm okay, I'm going to try out these 2 poems tonight and see how they go. That's kind of, I guess, what I use most. There are some people I send poems to and say, hey, what do you think about this? But more often than not, it's once I feel or the idea is set, okay, yeah, I'm ready to be aired out, I'll then go through, let me try it at these open mics. And they tend to be somewhat different audiences. So, like if you're reselling a Tidewater, like you mentioned earlier, and the poem works, I'll make sure I try it somewhere else too first. I might try it at Shawnee or at Full Circle, because it's there's overlap, but there's a little bit of a difference in the audiences. And if it works at 2 or 3, okay, there's something here. Um, I had something else that popped in my head as I was talking, and then it left. Oh, it'll come back. If it's important, it'll come back. It's the idea, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So how long have you been in Oklahoma?
Just over 2 years.
Just over 2 years. How would you explain this place to people who aren't from here? You talked about the writing community and how supportive it is, but Oklahoma's kind of a wacky place. I feel like I can say that. I've done enough of these interviews. It's how would you describe it?
It is a wacky place, and that's one of the things I love about it. And I didn't expect to fall in love with Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
I truly didn't, but I did.
Yeah.
I came here for Red Earth. I was living in Pennsylvania at the time, and every residency, I never wanted to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that was the camaraderie you form, but part of it was the state.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my ex-wife thought she's like, you fell in love with somebody else. I'm like, yeah, with Oklahoma. Can we move there? And that was a non-starter. But and I think what it is, it's there's such depth of history
Mm-hmm.
here, and that's what I was always drawn to. It's kind of cool when you go to Europe and you see these cities that have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of history, and you feel it when you're.
Yeah. Right.
And we don't have too much of that here. Boston has some of that, and Philadelphia has some of that. But we don't have it, and only because we're looking at a certain kind of history, so we don't see it. But Oklahoma kind of forces you. You don't have that option here. It's like, no, you're gonna understand and feel viscerally the history that goes much, much deeper from when we started having cobblestone streets and white people farming.
Yeah.
And I say in I think it was a poem I wrote for Ron Wallace for his anthology, that there's a line in there where, Oklahoma, there's a spirit here that is so palpable, and if you nod to it, it'll nod back. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what draws me here. It's not an easy place to live, and it's never promising you it will be easy, but it promises you it'll be honest. Mm-hmm. And I kind of dig that.
Yeah. It's and. The question I've asked a lot of writers here is, how do we encourage maybe the writers who are here in Oklahoma to stick around, and that this is a good place to create art? I think you've kind of addressed that some, but what other words of encouragement do you think you could give?
And I guess this kind of builds off the last question a little bit. That one of the things that Oklahoma kind of forces you to do is to accept the darkness. And I'm a writer who tends to like to go dark anyway.
Yeah.
And to embrace that darkness as kind of a vital component of how we grow and who we are. Mm-hmm. But to acknowledge it, which is, of course, interesting to bring up in current kind of larger educational discussions we're being forced to have.
Yeah, exactly.
And so to not be afraid of that is, I guess, one piece of advice. But just to go to the readings. Mm-hmm. I know some of the greatest movers and shakers when I came here aren't in Oklahoma anymore. I know Dorothy Alexander is. Mm-hmm. She's in Santa Fe. And Janetta, whenever I see Janetta, it's "Oh, Captain, my Captain" kind of thing. I mean, Janetta is about as important as it gets. And I know she's in Albuquerque now, but there are plenty of other people. I mean, I'll give you an example. I think that kind of, I'm trying to talk around it badly, but I think this does it. Is I was looking for those kind of groups in Pennsylvania for a while, and you can find new and struggling writers there who will band together and read and do the open mic, but you would find established writers who would they would give you the time of day if you acknowledge they're an established writer first. Oh. Where here, you can go chat with Ben Myers and he's or Ken Hada, and they're Ron Wallace. They're the most approachable people, and they don't care where you are on the success flowchart. Mm-hmm. They just care that you're a writer. One of the coolest moments at Scissortail, I think it was right after you interviewed Ron at Scissortail, is we went out and tossed a baseball around.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I was throwing a baseball around with Ron Wallace and Hank and Cullen Wisenhunt. And I'm like, this is the coolest thing ever. Mm-hmm. there's a moment. I'm all over the map right now. I apologize, but there's a moment in Lord of the Rings, which is my favorite book growing up, the trilogy, and where King Theoden is dying, and he's just done heroic crap, and his last words are, "I'm going to the hall of my fathers, in whose presence I will no longer feel shame."
Mm-hmm.
And I've talked to Hank about this. That last word is how I feel. When you're dealing with, like, you can hang out with these established writers and not feel shame.
Yeah.
And that's a cool feeling.
It's a really great way to put it, because Scissortail and why people love that festival at ECU and Ada so much has to do with the community, but and the support. But I don't think I've heard it phrased quite that way yet. Everyone has the same 15 minutes. Don't go over time. Ken will take care of that.
Yes.
So there's just this feeling of equality, I guess, and it's a very supportive place for new writers and established ones.
Yeah, it is a wonderful gathering.
Yeah, it's just this side to Oklahoma that I don't think really gets talked about, because if we're ever in the conversation on a state or even a national level, it's usually about the darker, the newsworthy things.
Right.
But this is an aspect of this place that I don't think we really talk about enough.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. So what are you working on next? We've talked about the memoir.
That's done.
You're
and
writing about Uber.
Thanks. I'm doing the same thing with Uber on the face. I don't know if it's going to become a book.
Oh, okay.
I haven't ruled it out. But
I just read your updates because they're fun and people are unbelievable. But you're focusing on the memoir and getting that.
Right, that's queried. And the other thing I did is when I was unemployed I've been unemployed for almost a year during COVID, is I finally wrote the novel manuscript that I kept saying I was going to write. So I got that completely done.
Oh, wow. That's great.
And that was cool. It's called Big Tuna.
Mm-hmm.
And the story behind that is in one of the few moments where my sister and I, and there would be pockets where we would get along. My father would always go to Puerto Rico as part of his scrap metal business, and he'd visit the canning industries. He'd go to Dole, the pineapple place, and he'd go to whichever, I can't remember whether it's Starkist or Chicken of the Sea. From his business, it was to kind of get the cans and recycled cans, but we never understood why he was going to Puerto Rico all the time. And it's because he was cheating on my mom, but we didn't know at the time. So we created a narrative where he's a hitman, because he was a big gun guy.
Yeah.
Like, he's a hitman. He's going down there to whack people. And so we started calling him Big Tuna. And that's where that died. And then I started talking about how funny that was. So it's a novel about a middle-aged hitman who's trying to realize kind of finally the moral implications of what he's doing, because he has kids now, and he sometimes has to kill people who look a lot like his kids. And he's like, well, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right anymore. Versus they're used to a lifestyle. How do I keep them in that lifestyle? And it's him wrestling through that. But I finally got it done, so that was
great. Wow.
Yeah.
An accomplishment in a normal time, but with a pandemic, I've talked to a few people, once we started doing interviews again, who some just have had a hard time getting anything done, and others have been real productive. So it really just depends. I guess it's all, like you said, the idea and what's hitting you, and when it's ready to write down.
Right. I think maybe just because it was dark subject matter, and it was it was a dark time. It's impossible not to think of dark things. So maybe that
would make sense. It's kind of a reflective time, the pandemic, when the whole world kind of stopped in a way, or at least stopped in a way that we'll probably ever know it again.
God, so sorry.
Yeah.
And it's interesting when you're unemployed how long a day is versus when you're on a vacation. Two totally different sets of time, even though it's the same. So I had nothing but time. So I figured, might as well do this.
Yeah. Well, was there anything else you wanted to talk about?
No, I think we covered everything I was hoping we talked about.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot. Well, thank you so much for your time, Paul.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.